My name is Naomi, and I am 34 years old. My sisters-in-laws abandoned her on a mountain highway in -12-degree weather while she was 7 months pregnant. She had to walk alone in the freezing dark bleeding, thinking her baby would not survive the night. They called it a harmless family prank. I called it attempted murder. When I found her shivering at a desolate gas station, I picked up my phone to call my brother and told him to do what he does best. They had no idea who she really was, or that our uncle was the state police captain. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic in-laws should face the ultimate karma. The nightmare began with a frantic phone call at 2 in the morning. I was wide awake in my Denver apartment, reviewing a corporate debt restructuring file. As a forensic auditor, my entire career is built on dismantling fraudulent companies and exposing financial criminals. I am used to high-stress environments and ruthless corporate warfare. But when my phone buzzed on my glass desk and I saw my sister Clara calling at that hour, my heart completely stopped. Clara is 29 years old and the kindest person I know. At 7 months pregnant, a call in the middle of the night meant a medical emergency. I answered the phone immediately. Instead of her usual cheerful voice, I heard the violent whipping sound of mountain wind and jagged, heavy breathing. I demanded to know where she was. Her voice was so frail it barely registered over the storm. She cried and begged for help. She told me she was at a closed Sinclair gas station off Route 82 deep in the Aspen Mountains. She said she was freezing, her stomach was cramping severely, and she could no longer feel her hands or feet. I threw on my heaviest winter coat, grabbed an emergency thermal blanket from my closet, and sprinted to my garage. The thermometer on my car dashboard read -12 degrees Celsius. The roads leading up the mountain were slick with treacherous black ice, but adrenaline overrode any sense of caution. I drove my SUV up the winding mountain pass like an absolute madman, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I felt a kind of cold, calculating rage I had never experienced before. 40 minutes later, my headlights swept across the dark abandoned gas station. A small figure was huddled against the ice-caked brick wall under a broken metal awning. I slammed the brakes, threw the car into park, and rushed out into the bitter wind. The sight of her made my blood run entirely cold. Clara was curled into a tight ball on the concrete, desperately trying to shield her swollen belly. She wore only a thin maternity blouse and a light wool cardigan. She had no winter coat and no gloves. Her designer maternity pants were torn wide open at both knees, the fabric soaked in dark, partially frozen blood. I scooped her up. She felt like a literal block of ice. I practically carried her to my car, shoving her into the passenger seat and cranking the heat to the absolute maximum. I wrapped the heavy thermal blanket tightly around her shaking shoulders and checked her pulse. It was terrifyingly erratic. I demanded to know where her husband Jamal was. She stammered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. She explained that Jamal was in Chicago for a mandatory business trip. Brenda and Tanya had insisted on taking her to an upscale dinner in Aspen for family bonding. Brenda is Jamal's mother. Tanya is his sister. They are Colorado old money, a wealthy African-American family who control a massive real estate portfolio. From the moment Jamal proposed, they treated Clara like trash, polluting their elite bloodline. Clara broke down crying, clutching her stomach in agony. She explained that on the drive back down the treacherous mountain, Brenda suddenly pulled the luxury SUV over to the shoulder. Brenda claimed she heard a loud pop from the rear tire and ordered Clara to step out and check it. Tanya laughed and said she would not ruin her designer boots in the snow. Trusting them, Clara stepped out into the freezing wind and walked to the back of the vehicle. The second she was outside, she heard the heavy door locks click. Tanya rolled down the window just enough to smirk and tell Clara to enjoy her midnight stroll. Then Brenda floored the gas pedal, abandoning a heavily pregnant woman in the pitch-black wilderness. Clara had to walk 3 miles down the pitch-black highway in the dead of winter. She slipped on the black ice and fell hard on her knees, terrified the violent impact had killed her baby. I did not offer empty words of comfort. I did not cry. This was a calculated effort to force a miscarriage. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed our brother Dominic. He picked up on the first ring. I told him Brenda and Tanya just crossed the line, and I needed him to initiate a full network breach on their family business by morning. They thought they had disposed of a weak, penniless girl. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you try to murder the sister of the woman who controls the financial guillotine. The drive down the mountain was a blur of black ice and blinding snow. I pushed my vehicle to its absolute mechanical limits, praying the heater would penetrate the terrible chill radiating from my sister. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness. Her breathing was dangerously shallow. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other gripping her frozen fingers, constantly talking to her to keep her awake. I told her about the future, about her baby, anything to keep her tethered to the living world. We hit the emergency bay of Denver General Hospital, with my tires screeching against the freezing pavement. Before the car even fully stopped, I was out and screaming for a trauma team. Medical staff flooded through the automatic doors. They took one look at Clara, saw the blood soaking her torn maternity pants and her blue lips, and immediately sprang into action. They loaded her onto a gurney and sprinted down the glaring white hallway. I tried to follow, but a nurse held me back, telling me they needed room to work. The next 2 hours were the longest of my entire life. I paced the sterile waiting room, my boots leaving wet tracks on the linoleum. I did not sit down. I could not drink the bitter coffee a receptionist offered me. I just stared at the double doors of the intensive care unit, running mental calculations of how I was going to utterly dismantle the people responsible for this. Finally, a doctor emerged. He looked completely exhausted. He told me Clara was stabilized, but her condition remained critical. She had suffered severe hypothermia and blunt force trauma to her knees from falling on the ice. The extreme physical and emotional stress had triggered early contractions. They managed to halt the premature labor with heavy medication, and by some absolute miracle, the baby still had a strong heartbeat. Clara was sedated and resting in a specialized room to slowly raise her core body temperature. The doctor looked me dead in the eye and said that if I had found her even 20 minutes later, neither of them would have survived. I thanked him, feeling a terrifying mix of relief and pure, unadulterated anger. Just as I turned to walk toward the recovery wing, the heavy emergency room doors flew open with a violent crash. Jamal burst into the hospital lobby. He was completely out of breath, his expensive wool coat hanging half off his shoulders, his tie pulled loose. He looked frantic, his eyes scanning the room wildly until they locked onto me. Jamal is a good man. He came from a family of venomous snakes, but he had always treated Clara like a queen. He has broad shoulders and a usually calm, commanding presence, but right now he was reduced to pure panic. "Naomi," he shouted, sprinting across the waiting room. "Where is she? Where is Clara? Is the baby okay?" The hospital called my emergency line. I held up my hands to steady him. "She is alive," I said firmly, watching his knees nearly buckle with relief. "She is sedated. The baby is holding on." But it was close, Jamal. Too close. He grabbed his head, pacing frantically. "I do not understand. I was in Chicago. My mother called me yesterday morning and told me I had to fly out immediately to handle a zoning dispute for our new commercial property. She said it was a crisis. She insisted I leave my personal phone at home and use a secure company burner phone because of corporate espionage risks. I was sitting in a hotel room for hours waiting for a meeting that never happened. When I finally checked my voicemail on the burner, the hospital had left a message. I chartered a private flight the second I heard. How did she end up on a mountain highway? I looked at my brother-in-law. The pieces fell perfectly into place. It was a calculated trap. "Jamal?" I said, my voice dropping to a serious low tone. "There was no zoning dispute. Your mother sent you away so Clara would be completely alone." He stopped pacing. The confusion on his face morphed into absolute horror. What are you talking about? Your mother and your sister Tanya invited Clara to dinner in Aspen tonight, I explained, watching the color drain from his face. On the way back, they pulled over, told her to check a tire, locked the doors, and drove away. They abandoned your pregnant wife in negative 12-degree weather. Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The fake business trip, the burner phone, the isolation. His own mother had orchestrated a hit on his wife and his unborn child. He backed up against the wall, sliding down slightly as the sheer evil of his family washed over him. He did not cry. Instead, a terrifyingly dark look crossed his face. The initial shock had evaporated, only absolute fury remained. Before Jamal could say another word, the automatic sliding doors of the emergency room hissed open again. And there they were, the architects of this nightmare walking into the hospital. The automatic glass doors slid open, bringing a rush of freezing wind into the sterile hospital lobby. Brenda and Tanya walked through, completely shattering the quiet tension of the emergency room. They did not look like two women who had just abandoned a pregnant family member on a treacherous mountain pass. They looked like they were arriving at a high society charity gala. Brenda wore a floor-length white mink coat, her neck draped in heavy, glittering gold jewelry. Tanya strutted right beside her in a designer wool cape, clutching an oversized crocodile skin handbag. The overwhelming, suffocating scent of their expensive floral perfume instantly masked the sharp smell of hospital antiseptic. They showed absolutely zero remorse. In fact, Tanya was casually scrolling on her phone, looking profoundly bored by the entire situation. Jamal did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged across the waiting room. He grabbed his mother by the shoulders of her fur coat, his eyes wild with a fury I had never seen in him before. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice echoing violently off the hospital walls. Nurses and patients turned to stare. "What did you do to my wife?" Brenda violently shoved his hands away and brushed her coat as if his touch had soiled the expensive fur. She looked at him with sheer annoyance. "Jamal, lower your voice this instant. You are making a ridiculous scene in front of the hospital staff. Have some dignity." "Dignity," Jamal yelled, stepping closer to her, his chest heaving. "You sent me to Chicago on a fake business trip. You locked Clara out of the car in the middle of a blizzard. She is in the intensive care unit right now. She almost froze to death." Tanya rolled her eyes and loudly sighed, finally looking up from her screen. "Oh, please, Jamal, stop being so dramatic. We were only gone for 10 minutes. The girl just panicked and wandered off into the dark like an idiot. Before Jamal could respond, the lead trauma doctor walked out of the double doors. He held a medical clipboard and looked between the three of them with a deep, furious scowl. He demanded to know who was shouting in his emergency room. Brenda immediately shifted her demeanor, pasting on a fake aristocratic smile. She stepped forward, extending a hand dripping with diamond rings. "Doctor, I am Brenda Jamal's mother. I apologize for my son's little outburst. He is just a bit overprotective. Please do not tell me that fragile little girl actually convinced you she was in real danger." The doctor stared at her outstretched hand and did not take it. "Madam, your daughter-in-law was brought in with a core body temperature that was shutting down her internal organs. She had severe lacerations on her knees and was entering premature labor. Another half hour in those elements and I would be signing 2 death certificates tonight." Instead of horror, Brenda let out a soft, dismissive laugh. She actually chuckled right in the face of the trauma surgeon. "Doctor, I assure you it was nothing more than a harmless family initiation prank. You see, we come from a very prominent lineage. We have a certain standard to uphold in our community. Clara comes from a very weak working-class background. We simply needed to test if she was resilient enough to carry our family's heir. A little walk in the snow builds character. We fully intended to drive back and pick her up. We just wanted to scare her a little to see what she was made of." Tanya chimed in, crossing her arms defensively. "Exactly. If she cannot handle a little cold weather, how is she supposed to handle the immense pressure of running a real estate empire one day? She completely overreacted. It is her own fault for walking away from the drop-off point instead of waiting for us." The doctor looked at them as if they were alien creatures. "You abandoned a woman in her third trimester in -12-degree weather as a test," he asked, his voice shaking with pure, unfiltered disgust. "It is a family tradition," Brenda snapped, her fake smile dropping instantly. "It is none of your business how we manage our internal family affairs. Now where is the billing department? I want to pay whatever nominal fee is required to get her discharged right now, so we can put this embarrassing spectacle behind us." Jamal looked at his mother and sister as if he was seeing them for the very first time. His hands were trembling with rage. He stepped right into his mother's face. "You are a monster," he whispered, his voice cracking with terrifying intensity. "If my wife dies, or if my baby dies, I swear to God I will tear your entire life apart piece by piece." Brenda scoffed, entirely unbothered by her son's agony. "Stop acting like a commoner, Jamal. She is perfectly fine. Women have babies every day." I stood a few feet away, leaning against the cold wall, observing the entire exchange. I did not scream. I did not cry. I let them talk. I let them boast to a medical professional about their intentional cruelty. They were too arrogant to realize they had just confessed to a felony in a room full of witnesses. They thought their money made them untouchable. The tense standoff in the hospital lobby was suddenly broken by a nurse calling Jamal's name. She quietly informed him that Clara was awake. Without another word to his mother, Jamal sprinted past the reception desk and pushed through the double doors of the intensive care unit. I followed closely behind him. I expected Brenda and Tanya to take the opportunity to leave, but to my absolute disgust, the distinct clicking of their designer heels echoed right behind me. They bypassed the protesting security guard, arrogantly flashing their platinum credit cards and demanding access as immediate family members. We entered a dimly lit room filled with the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. Clara looked incredibly small in the center of the mechanical bed. Her skin was still terrifyingly pale. IV lines ran into both of her arms. Jamal immediately dropped to his knees beside her bed. He took her fragile hand and pressed it against his forehead, whispering desperate apologies, tears finally breaking his composure. He told her he would never leave her side again. Clara managed a weak smile, but her eyes widened with sheer panic when she saw Brenda and Tanya standing in the doorway. Brenda did not look at her daughter-in-law with an ounce of sympathy. She looked around the cramped hospital room with open disdain, pulling her white mink coat tighter around her shoulders. Tanya stood behind her, loudly chewing gum and scrolling on her phone, completely oblivious to the trauma they had just caused. Brenda let out a heavy sigh, opening her oversized crocodile skin handbag. She pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a gold pen. She scribbled a number down, ripped the paper from the spine, and walked to the foot of the bed. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, she tossed the piece of paper right onto Clara's hospital blanket. It was a check for exactly $10,000. "Take that," Brenda said, directing her cold gaze toward me instead of Clara. "Buy the girl some decent maternity clothes so she does not look like a complete beggar next time we take her out in public. Use the rest to pay whatever copay this hospital demands. And keep your mouth shut. We are done playing this little victim game tonight." Tanya finally looked up from her phone and smirked. Honestly, if she had dressed appropriately, instead of wearing cheap rags, she probably would not have frozen so quickly. Consider it a generosity tax from us. Jamal shot up from the floor, his fists clenched, ready to physically throw his mother out of the room. I put my hand on his shoulder and gently pulled him back. I did not scream. I did not throw the check back in her face. I did not let my anger consume me. In the world of forensic auditing, emotions get you fired. Evidence gets you convictions. I calmly stepped forward and picked the check off the blanket. I held it up to the harsh fluorescent light, inspecting the signature and the bold $10,000 figure. Then I looked directly at Brenda and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the calculated, dead-eyed smile of a predator watching a mouse walk willingly into a steel trap. I carefully folded the check in half and slid it deep into the breast pocket of my winter coat. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. "I appreciate the contribution. But you see, you are a bit confused about what this piece of paper actually is. You think this is hush money. You think this buys our silence. But in a court of law, this is what we call an admission of guilt." Brenda narrowed her eyes, her aristocratic posture stiffening. "What nonsense are you talking about?" I took one slow step toward her. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You just handed me a financially traceable document signed by your own hand, dated on the exact night my pregnant sister was abandoned on a freezing mountain highway. You just provided physical, undeniable proof that you were with her tonight. When the police ask how she ended up on the side of the road and you try to claim you were safely asleep in your mansion, I am going to hand this check to the district attorney." Tanya stopped chewing her gum. The smirk vanished from her face. "You just bought yourself a one-way ticket to a felony conviction." I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think your money makes you untouchable. But arrogance is a massive liability. You do not know who I am. You do not know what I do for a living. And you have absolutely no idea what I'm about to do to your family. Now get out of this room before I have you arrested for trespassing." For the first time since I met her, Brenda looked genuinely unsettled. The color drained slightly from her heavily powdered face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the absolute certainty in my eyes stopped her. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the hospital room, Tanya rushing nervously behind her. They had come to assert their dominance, but they left carrying the terrifying realization that they had just handed me the weapon I would use to destroy them. The heavy hospital door clicked shut behind Brenda and Tanya. The suffocating scent of their perfume lingered in the air for a few moments before the sterile smell of antiseptic finally overtook it. Jamal did not look back at the door. He turned entirely toward Clara, pulling a plastic chair flush against her bed. He buried his face in her hands, softly crying, and whispering promises that he would protect her and their baby. I gave them their privacy, stepping out into the quiet hallway to let the adrenaline slowly drain from my system. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Denver skyline, casting a pale, cold light through the hospital windows. The immediate physical danger had passed, but I knew the actual war was just beginning. Brenda was not a woman who retreated gracefully. She was a woman who burned the earth when she felt threatened. 3 hours later, the retaliation began. I was standing by the hospital cafeteria counter buying 2 black coffees when Jamal walked up behind me. He looked completely exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. He reached into his wallet and handed the cashier his heavy metal corporate credit card. The cashier swiped it, frowned, and swiped it again. The machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red declined message. Jamal furrowed his brow, pulling out a different platinum card. He swiped it himself. Declined. He pulled out his personal debit card linked to his trust fund. Declined. Jamal stared at the glowing red screen, his jaw tightening. I stepped forward, tapped my phone to the payment terminal, and paid for the coffee. We walked to a small, secluded table in the corner of the cafeteria. Jamal pulled out his phone and opened his banking application. The screen loaded, revealing a row of zeros and locked symbols across every single account he owned. His private wealth manager had sent him an automated message stating that all accounts tied to the family portfolio had been suspended, pending a primary account holder review. Then an email notification popped up on his screen. It was marked high importance from the board of directors of his family's real estate firm. Jamal opened it, his eyes scanning the corporate jargon. He let out a dry, humorless laugh and pushed the phone across the table toward me. The email was drafted by the company's legal department, but the vicious tone was entirely Brenda. It stated that Jamal was being placed on indefinite unpaid administrative leave due to erratic personal behavior. It explicitly warned that if he did not report to the main office by noon to sign a separation agreement regarding his marriage, the board would convene to permanently strip him of his executive title and entirely remove him from the family trust. She was trying to starve him out. She believed that cutting off his access to their massive wealth would force him to crawl back on his hands and knees and abandon his pregnant wife. Jamal looked at me, his expression hardening into pure resolve. He picked up the phone, deleted the email, and blocked the sender. He told me he did not care if he never saw another dime of their money. He said he would rather flip burgers for the rest of his life than let those women near his child. I felt a surge of immense respect for him. He was finally breaking the chains of his toxic lineage. Right at that moment, my own phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw a string of rapid-fire text messages from an unknown number. I did not need to guess who it was. The sheer level of arrogance in the text gave Tanya away immediately. Emboldened by her mother cutting off Jamal, Tanya decided it was the perfect time to gloat. The first message read, "Good luck paying those hospital bills, you cheap gold digger. Jamal is cut off. You and your pathetic sister are getting absolutely nothing from this family." The second message arrived a second later. "You honestly thought you could threaten us? You are the daughters of a literal garbage man. Your father collected other people's trash for a living. Go back to the slums where you belong." I read the messages twice. A genuine bright smile spread across my face. Tanya was so desperately blinded by her own elitism that she never bothered to do a simple background check. She only knew what Clara had casually mentioned years ago, that our late father worked in waste management. In Tanya's shallow mind, that meant he rode on the back of a garbage truck. She had absolutely no idea who she was insulting. Yes, our father started with a single-used garbage truck, but he did not stop there. He was a brilliant self-taught innovator who spent a decade building a revolutionary sanitation routing software. When he realized how valuable it was, he patented the technology and sold it to a national waste management conglomerate for $40 million. He passed away shortly after leaving his entire fortune equally divided among Clara, Dominic, and me in airtight, high-yield trust funds. We were raised to be humble. We drove average cars, lived in normal homes, and worked intense, demanding jobs because our father taught us the value of hard work. I work as a senior forensic auditor because I genuinely enjoy dismantling corrupt corporations, not because I need a paycheck to survive. Clara, Dominic, and I possessed a level of quiet liquid wealth that completely dwarfed Brenda's highly leveraged, debt-ridden real estate empire. Tanya thought she was mocking a helpless, broke family. She did not know she had just declared war on a financial fortress. I locked my phone, finished my coffee, and stood up. It was time to show them exactly what the daughters of a garbage man could do. I walked out of the hospital cafeteria, the cold morning sunlight reflecting off the polished linoleum floors. I found a quiet, empty alcove near the administrative wing and pulled out my phone. I dialed my brother Dominic. He is 36 years old and runs an elite cybersecurity firm in downtown Denver. To the corporate world, he is a highly paid consultant who tests network vulnerabilities. To the underground community, he is one of the most brilliant white-hat hackers in the country. He answered on the first ring. The rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoed through the speaker. "Tell me she is safe," Dominic said, his voice tight with lingering anxiety. "She is stable," I replied, staring out the window at the snow-covered parking lot. "Jamal is with her. They are keeping her sedated for now, but the doctor said she passed the critical window. The baby is holding on." I heard a heavy exhale on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a coffee mug being set down hard on a wooden desk. "Good. Because I have been sitting in the dark for 3 hours waiting for your green light. Give me a target, Naomi." I smiled. "Tanya just texted me. She called us the broke daughters of a garbage man. She told me to go back to the slums and good luck paying the hospital bills." Dominic let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "A garbage man. That is incredible. These people truly live in a bubble of their own absolute ignorance. Did you tell her that our garbage man father developed the predictive sanitation routing software that her own city currently uses?" I did not, I said, leaning against the cold glass of the window. I think it is much better if they find out the hard way. They honestly believe we are desperate. They think cutting Jamal off from his trust fund is going to starve Clara out. They have no idea that Dad sold his patent for $40 million before he died. They do not realize Clara has an 8-figure trust fund sitting in a high-yield account that she never touches because she prefers living a quiet, modest life. People like Brenda and Tanya cannot comprehend wealth that does not scream for attention, Dominic replied, the keyboard clacking resuming at a much faster pace. They buy mink coats and luxury cars on credit to look rich. Dad drove a 10-year-old truck and wore work boots, but he could have bought their entire neighborhood in cash. So what is the play here? Do we just bury them in a civil suit? No, I said, my voice hardening. A civil suit takes years. They will just hide behind their expensive lawyers and drag it out until Clara is exhausted. I want them destroyed right now. I want their reputation, their company, and their freedom completely dismantled. Dominic chuckled softly. This is exactly why you became a forensic auditor, isn't it? You could have retired at 25 and lived on a private island with your share of the inheritance. Instead, you spend 80 hours a week hunting down corporate fraud. I do not work for a paycheck, Dominic. I work for the leverage, I explained, watching a sleek black luxury car pull into the hospital parking lot below. I became an auditor because I realized early on that the worst kinds of predators wear tailored suits and hide behind corporate entities. I hunt arrogant people who think the rules do not apply to them. I dissect their finances. I find their hidden leverage, and I use it to crush them. Brenda thinks she holds all the power because she controls Jamal's bank accounts. I want to know exactly what she is hiding in her own. Consider it done, Dominic said, his tone shifting into pure professional focus. I am bypassing the firewalls of their primary real estate firm right now. Give me a few hours. I will dig through their offshore accounts, their tax filings, their corporate debt ledgers, and every single deleted email on their private servers. I will find the rotting foundation holding up their little empire. Find the leverage, Dominic. Find the one thread I can pull to make their entire life unravel. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. The pieces were moving into place. Brenda and Tanya had spent their entire lives bullying people they perceived as weaker than them. They assumed Clara was an easy target because she was gentle and kind, but they forgot that Clara had siblings. They woke up a sleeping giant, and I was going to make sure they felt the full crushing weight of their mistake. I walked back toward the intensive care unit, ready to stand guard over my sister, while Dominic prepared the financial execution. The hospital hallway felt colder now, but my mind was entirely focused on the destruction of the people who tried to destroy my family. I walked back into the intensive care unit. The room was quiet except for the steady, reassuring beep of the heart monitor. Jamal was sitting in the same uncomfortable plastic chair, his head resting against the edge of Clara's mattress. He had finally fallen asleep out of sheer physical and emotional exhaustion, his large hands still gently wrapped around my sister's fingers. I sat quietly in the corner, watching the morning sun illuminate the sterile hospital room. My mind was racing, calculating every possible angle of attack. I knew Brenda was hiding something. People who possess true generational wealth do not need to constantly broadcast it to the world. Their desperate need to wear expensive furs into an emergency room and financially threaten their own family members was a massive psychological tell. They were overcompensating. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It was a secure, encrypted text from Dominic. The message was short and direct. Check your secure email server, then call me. You are going to love this. I slipped out of the room silently so I would not wake Jamal or Clara. I walked down the hall to an empty visitor lounge, opened my laptop, and logged into my encrypted work portal. Dominic had sent over a massive, heavily compressed folder containing thousands of internal corporate documents from Brenda's real estate firm. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. He answered with a low, triumphant chuckle. I have to admit, he said, his voice echoing slightly over the speaker. I expected a challenge, but their corporate firewall was pathetically outdated. Do you know why? Because they have not paid their cybersecurity vendor in 8 months. Their IT department has been running on a skeleton crew. I opened the first master spreadsheet, my trained eyes instantly scanning the columns of red numbers. What am I looking at, Dominic? You are looking at a spectacular, catastrophic financial meltdown, he replied, the excitement clear in his voice. Brenda and Tanya have been parading around Denver like absolute royalty, but their entire real estate portfolio is completely underwater. They own 6 major commercial properties downtown, but 3 of them have been sitting completely empty since last year. Their rental income dried up, but their lavish lifestyle did not change. I scrolled down to the corporate debt ledger. My jaw tightened as I saw the sheer volume of high-interest loans. They are highly leveraged, I murmured, analyzing the ridiculous interest rates they had agreed to. Leveraged is an understatement, Dominic corrected. They are drowning. But it gets so much better. Look at the file labeled Series B bonds. I opened the document. It was a prospectus for a massive bond issuance they sold to private investors 6 months ago. As a forensic auditor, I immediately recognized the structure. To issue corporate bonds of that size, you need to prove your commercial properties generate enough steady revenue to cover the massive interest payments. Cross-reference the occupancy rates on the bond prospectus with the actual internal rent rolls I attached in the next folder, Dominic instructed. I opened the second folder and compared the numbers side by side. A cold, victorious smile spread across my face. On the official bond documents filed with the state, Brenda claimed her commercial buildings were 95% occupied. But the internal private rent rolls proved they were barely at 40%. They falsified the occupancy rates, I said, my voice dropping as the magnitude of the crime set in. They lied to their investors about their revenue to secure millions of dollars in bonds. Exactly, Dominic confirmed. It is textbook bond fraud, a massive federal offense. They used the new bond money to pay the mortgages on the empty buildings and to fund their own luxury shopping sprees. It is essentially a corporate Ponzi scheme. But here is the absolute best part. The music is about to stop. Look at their upcoming liabilities. I navigated to the upcoming payments schedule. A massive, glaring red number jumped off the screen. They had a balloon payment of $5 million due on a primary bank loan in exactly 7 days. If they defaulted on that payment, the bank would audit their properties, the bond fraud would be exposed, and the entire house of cards would violently collapse. They are entirely out of cash, Naomi Dominic said quietly. They are one missed payment away from total bankruptcy and federal prison. That is why Brenda was so desperate to control Jamal. She needed his clean trust fund to help cover the deficit. When he chose Clara tonight, she lost her emergency parachute. I stared at the screen, the ultimate weapon now resting perfectly in my hands. Brenda was backed into a terrifying corner. She was suffocating under the weight of her own criminal arrogance. I knew exactly what she would do next. Desperate people always look for fast money. She would try to secure a high-risk short-term bridge loan from a corporate equity firm to cover the $5 million balloon payment. Dominic, I said, closing my laptop with a satisfying snap. Send all of these files to my secure server at Apex Holdings. Are you going to report them to the authorities? He asked. Not yet. I replied, a chilling sense of purpose washing over me. I am going to let Brenda think she found a lifeline. I am going to let her walk right into my territory. By the end of this week, I will not just expose her fraud. I will own her entire empire. I closed my laptop and walked back to the intensive care unit. The hospital corridors were bustling with morning shift nurses pushing heavy medical carts, but inside Clara's room, a fragile peace remained. Jamal was still asleep in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his head resting heavily near Clara's shoulder. She was awake now, staring blankly at the ceiling, her face extremely pale, but her eyes clear. I walked to her bedside, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and gently squeezed her hand. I told her she was completely safe, and that I already had a plan in motion to protect them. But before she could even ask what I meant, the heavy wooden door to her room swung open with a violent crash. The sudden, aggressive noise jolted Jamal awake. He jumped up immediately, instinctively stepping in front of Clara's hospital bed to shield her. Standing in the doorway was Tanya, wearing a sharp designer business suit and casually holding a silver coffee cup. Right behind her was a short, balding man carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable greasy aura of a bottom-feeding corporate lawyer. Tanya did not even acknowledge Jamal. She marched straight to the foot of the hospital bed, her expensive heels clicking loudly and obnoxiously against the polished linoleum floor. I am going to make this extremely quick, because the smell of this hospital is making me nauseous, Tanya announced, waving her hand dramatically in front of her face. This is Mr. Higgins. He is one of the senior partners at our family legal firm. We brought some paperwork that needs to be signed immediately. Jamal glared at his sister, his entire body tensing with anger. Get out of this room right now, Tanya. My wife is in intensive care. You have absolutely no right to be here. Tanya ignored him entirely. She snapped her fingers, and Mr. Higgins pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase. He walked forward and dropped them right onto Clara's rolling tray table. The heavy thud made Clara flinch. Tanya crossed her arms and offered a deeply venomous smile. Since Jamal decided to throw a childish tantrum and get himself cut off from the family fortune, we had to do a thorough review of his financial obligations, Tanya stated coldly. It turns out without our mother's money, he cannot even afford the basic deductible for this hospital stay. And since you do not have health insurance that covers premature neonatal care, you are looking at a medical bill of roughly $300,000. Clara looked at the stack of papers, her breathing hitching in sheer panic. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Tanya leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of the bed. That is an addendum to the prenuptial agreement you supposedly signed before the wedding. My mother is a very generous woman, Clara. She is willing to cover every single dime of your medical expenses. She will pay for the best doctors, the best incubators, and a private recovery suite. But in exchange, you are going to sign over full, permanent legal and physical custody of the child to my mother, the very moment it is born. Jamal erupted. He lunged across the hospital bed and grabbed Mr. Higgins by the collar of his cheap suit, shoving him hard against the wall. Are you out of your mind? Jamal roared, his voice shaking the surrounding medical equipment. You think you can waltz into a hospital room and buy my child? There was no prenuptial agreement. I refuse to draft one. That document is completely fabricated. Mr. Higgins raised his hands defensively, frantically adjusting his crooked glasses. Sir, please release me. I am simply acting on behalf of my client. If you dispute the document, you are welcome to fight it in family court. But I assure you, litigation will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars that you no longer possess. Tanya laughed, a cold, empty sound that echoed in the small room. That is the beauty of it, Jamal. We have unlimited resources. We will bury you in endless legal motions until you are both living on the street. Sign the paper, Clara. Take the medical bill coverage, go back to your pathetic life, and let us raise the heir to our empire properly. You are a broke, insignificant girl who got lucky for a few years. It is time to cash out and walk away. Clara was crying silently, overwhelmed by the sheer viciousness of the attack. Jamal was shaking with rage, still pinning the corrupt lawyer against the wall. It was the perfect trap designed to exploit a terrifying financial weakness. But Tanya had made one fatal miscalculation. She forgot I was standing quietly in the corner of the room. I stepped forward, picked up the fraudulent contract, and began to read it. I did not yell. I did not show anger. I simply smiled. Jamal, let him go, I said calmly, not taking my eyes off the crisp legal document in my hands. Jamal turned his head to look at me, his face contorted in absolute disbelief. He did not release his grip on the lawyer's collar. Naomi, did you hear what they just said? They are trying to steal my baby. This contract is completely fake. I know exactly what they are trying to do, I replied, keeping my voice soft and measured. But assaulting a lawyer in a hospital room is exactly what Tanya wants. It will give her leverage to call the police and have you arrested. Let him go right now." Jamal hesitated, his chest heaving, but the logic pierced through his anger. He slowly opened his hands, letting Mr. Higgins stumble backward. The lawyer violently straightened his wrinkled suit jacket and gasped for air, his face flushed red. Tanya smirked, crossing her arms in triumph. "Finally, someone in this pathetic room has a functioning brain. I am glad you understand your position, Naomi. You have no money. Jamal has no money. My mother holds all the cards." I lowered the document and looked at Tanya carefully, schooling my features into an expression of defeated resignation. I needed her to believe that her psychological warfare was working. I needed her to feel like an absolute conqueror. "Tanya, you have to understand. This is a massive shock," I said, making my voice sound appropriately desperate. "Clara just survived a traumatic experience. We cannot pay a $300,000 medical bill. We know that. But asking a mother to sign away her child before it is even born is extreme. Cannot we negotiate a payment plan?" Tanya let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "A payment plan? With what money? Your salary as a glorified accountant?" "No, Naomi. The terms are non-negotiable. Clara signs the child over to my mother, or we walk out that door and you figure out how to pay this hospital on your own. You have 24 hours to decide." Mr. Higgins adjusted his crooked glasses, trying to regain his professional composure. He reached out to take the document back from me. "If your sister refuses to sign, we are fully prepared to file an emergency custody petition the moment the child is born, citing financial instability and an unfit living environment. We will tie you up in litigation for years." I pulled the document out of his reach. I looked down at the floor, acting as if I was swallowing my pride. Then I looked back up at the lawyer. "We will review it," I said quietly. "Naomi." "No." Clara sobbed from the bed, her voice cracking. "I am not giving them my baby." I walked over to Clara, taking her hand and giving it a firm double squeeze. It was our childhood signal. It meant, "Trust me completely." "We have no choice, Clara," I said aloud for Tanya to hear. "We do not have the funds to fight a family with this kind of wealth. But, Mr. Higgins, if we are going to consider this, the contract is too vague regarding Clara's immediate medical care." Higgins frowned. "What do you mean?" I flipped to the second page of the fabricated agreement. "It says Brenda will cover medical expenses, but it does not specify neonatal intensive care costs, private recovery rooms, or specialized pediatric surgeons if there are complications from the extreme cold exposure. If Clara is going to make the ultimate sacrifice, you need to guarantee her physical safety in writing. I want a fully revised contract detailing every single medical contingency, and I want it drafted by tomorrow morning." Tanya rolled her eyes impatiently. "Fine. Higgins, add whatever medical clauses the beggar wants. Just make sure the custody relinquishment is airtight." Mr. Higgins looked slightly nervous. "Ms. Tanya, drafting those specific medical contingencies will require extensive consultation with hospital administrators. It will take me and my paralegal team at least 10 billable hours to expedite the revisions by tomorrow morning." "I do not care what it costs," Tanya snapped, completely falling for the bait. "Bill my mother's corporate account. Just get it done so we can be finished with these peasants." I handed the document back to Higgins, my expression perfectly subdued. "Thank you," I said softly. "We will await the revised version." Tanya gave us one final look of absolute disgust. She turned on her expensive heels and strutted out of the hospital room, Higgins scurrying closely behind her. The heavy door clicked shut. The second they were gone, Jamal turned to me, his eyes wide with betrayal. "What is wrong with you? Why did you just agree to negotiate with them? We are not giving them my child." I dropped the defeated act instantly. My posture straightened, and a sharp, calculating smile returned to my face. I walked over to the window, watching Tanya's luxury car pull out of the hospital parking lot. "I am not giving them anything, Jamal," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. I just tricked them into billing their own crumbling corporate account for another 10 hours of emergency legal fees. They are completely broke, Jamal. They are committing massive bond fraud, and they have a $5 million bank payment due in 7 days that they cannot afford. I am going to bleed them dry dollar by billable dollar until the federal authorities lock them in a cage. Jamal stared at me, completely stunned into silence. The trap was set, and Tanya had just happily locked herself inside. I left Clara's hospital room shortly after Tanya and her sleazy lawyer departed. I needed to move fast. Jamal stayed by Clara's side, completely unaware of the massive financial machinery I was currently spinning into motion. I walked out to my SUV, sat in the driver's seat, and opened my encrypted laptop. If Tanya thought she could use the legal system as a weapon to steal my sister's child, I was going to show her what a real legal massacre looked like. I did not need a cheap corporate yes-man like Mr. Higgins. I needed an absolute shark. And in the state of Colorado, there was no bigger shark in family law than Richard Montgomery. Richard was notorious. He charged $1,000 an hour, only took high-profile cases, and completely destroyed opposing counsel in the courtroom. He was exactly what I needed. But I could not hire him under my own name. If Brenda or Tanya traced the payment back to me, they would instantly realize I had money, and my entire element of surprise would be ruined. So I routed a wire transfer of $200,000 through a blind shell corporation I managed under Apex Holdings. I secured Richard's services on an unlimited retainer, listing an anonymous philanthropic organization as his benefactor. I gave him one simple, absolute directive: destroy the fabricated prenuptial agreement and make Brenda's legal team bleed for every single inch of ground. Less than 4 hours later, Richard Montgomery struck. He did not send a polite email. He sent a process server directly to the lobby of Brenda's real estate headquarters. The server walked right past the security desk and handed Mr. Higgins an emergency injunction, a cease and desist order regarding the unborn child, and a brutal notice of intent to sue for extreme emotional distress and medical endangerment. When Mr. Higgins read the name of the opposing counsel, Dominic told me the man practically dropped his briefcase in sheer terror. Dominic was actively monitoring their internal corporate communications, intercepting every email and phone call. He called me later that afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely speak. He patched me into a recorded phone call between Brenda and Tanya. The audio quality was crystal clear. Brenda was screaming at the top of her lungs, shattering the polished, aristocratic facade she loved to project. "How in the world did that penniless girl get—" Richard Montgomery, Brenda shrieked through the phone. "Do you have any idea who that man is? He destroyed the mayor in his divorce trial last year. He requires a 6-figure retainer just to look at a file. Where is the money coming from?" Tanya sounded frantic, her previous arrogance completely vaporized. "I do not know, Mother. Higgins said it looks like some anonymous domestic violence charity took up her case. They filed an injunction against our custody addendum. Higgins says Montgomery is demanding a full forensic audit of our personal finances to prove we can actually provide a stable environment for the child. If he looks at our accounts, he will see the bond deficit. He will see everything." The sheer panic in Tanya's voice was absolute music to my ears. I had intentionally instructed Richard to threaten a financial discovery motion. It was a terrifying trigger word for someone currently committing federal fraud. Brenda realized that if she backed down now, Richard would steamroll them and expose their crumbling empire to the authorities. She only had one option left, driven entirely by her massive ego and her desperate need for absolute control. She had to fight back with overwhelming force to protect her secrets. "I am not losing to a charity case," Brenda snarled into the phone. "Call Higgins. Tell him to hire the 4 best litigators in his firm to assist him. I want a team of 5 lawyers working around the clock. Bury Montgomery in paperwork. File every motion, every objection, every delay tactic in the book. I want them crushed by tomorrow morning." But Mother Tanya hesitated, her voice trembling. "Higgins requires an upfront retainer of $50,000 per lawyer for emergency litigation of this scale. We do not have $250,000 in liquid cash." Our operating accounts are completely drained. The balloon payment for the bank is due in exactly 6 days. Liquidate the emergency corporate reserves, Brenda commanded blindly. Sell the remaining company stock options at a loss if you have to. Just get the cash and pay the lawyers. We will secure that bridge loan from Apex Holdings to cover the bank payment. Do it now. The recording ended with a sharp click. I sat in my car staring at the snowy Denver skyline and smiled. Brenda had just done exactly what I wanted. She was so blinded by her hatred for Clara and her obsessive need to win that she was voluntarily draining the very last drops of her company's lifeblood to pay for a legal war she could never win. She was willingly suffocating her own business. And the funniest part of all was that she was banking her entire survival on a magical loan from Apex Holdings, a loan that I was personally going to review right before I pulled the floor out from under her. I returned to the hospital room just as Jamal was standing up from the plastic chair beside Clara's bed. He was putting on his heavy winter coat and he looked entirely different. The panic and exhaustion from the night before were completely gone, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. He looked at me and asked me to watch Clara for an hour. I asked him where he was going. He looked me dead in the eye and said he had a toxic anchor to cut. He walked out of the room and I knew exactly what he was about to do. I did not let him go alone, but I knew he needed to handle this confrontation himself. I stayed in the hospital room with my sleeping sister, but I immediately texted Dominic. I told him Jamal was heading straight to the family corporate headquarters. Within minutes, Dominic hacked into the executive office security cameras and patched the live high-definition feed directly to my encrypted laptop. I sat in the quiet hospital room watching the video feed on my screen as Jamal marched through the heavy glass doors of his mother's real estate firm. Brenda and Tanya were pacing nervously inside Brenda's opulent corner office. They looked incredibly stressed, likely panicking over the massive retainer they just had to drain from their accounts to pay their new legal team. When Jamal walked through the door, Brenda immediately stopped pacing. She straightened her posture quickly, plastering on a look of smug superiority. Even before Dominic managed to route the audio feed, I could read her body language perfectly. She thought Jamal was crawling back to her. She honestly believed that the threat of cutting off his trust fund had worked, and he was there to beg for financial forgiveness. Jamal walked straight up to her massive mahogany desk. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the legal separation agreement the company had emailed him that morning. He grabbed a heavy gold pen from Brenda's desk, flipped to the very last page, and signed his name with aggressive sweeping strokes. He tossed the signed document directly onto her keyboard. Then he unclipped his executive security badge from his belt. He did not place it gently on the desk. He dropped it onto the floor right at Brenda's designer heels. Dominic suddenly managed to bypass the final firewall and route the room's intercom microphone to my speakers. The audio crackled to life, just in time for me to hear Jamal's final declaration. "I am completely done," Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "I formally renounce the trust fund. I resign from the board of directors. I want absolutely nothing to do with this company, this legacy, or either of you. I am choosing my wife and my child. Do not ever contact my family again." Brenda stared at the corporate badge resting on the floor, her face twisting into a terrifying mask of pure, unhinged rage. Her aristocratic control shattered entirely. "You ungrateful fool!" she screamed, stepping furiously around the desk. "You think you can just walk away from me? You are nothing without my money. You have never struggled a single day in your life. That pathetic girl has poisoned your mind, and you are throwing away an empire for her." Jamal did not flinch. He turned his back on her and started walking toward the door. Brenda's voice reached a hysterical echoing pitch. "If you walk out that door, I will ruin you. I swear I will permanently ruin both of your lives. I will spend every last dime I possess to make sure you never get a job in this entire state. I will bury your wife in court until she completely breaks." Jamal did not stop walking. He pushed through the glass doors and left the building, walking away a completely free man. Back in the office, Brenda was hyperventilating. Tanya rushed to her side, looking genuinely panicked. "Mother, what do we do? We just drained the emergency accounts for the lawyers. We need cash right now to survive." Brenda slammed her hands down on the desk, her eyes wild with vindictive desperation. She was entirely consumed by the need to destroy Jamal and Clara to prove her dominance. She grabbed the telephone. "Get the broker on the line," Brenda commanded Tanya, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We are pushing the Apex Holdings loan through today. Tell them to double the request to $10 million. I need enough capital to crush Jamal and pay off the bank." Tanya hesitated, her voice trembling. "Mother, to secure a loan that large immediately, we need massive collateral. The commercial buildings are already leveraged." Brenda looked out the window, her expression hardening into absolute madness. "Then use the primary family estate. Put up the mansion." Tanya gasped, terrified by the massive gamble. Putting up the ancestral home was financial suicide if the loan defaulted. But Brenda was too blinded by arrogance and revenge to care. I watched the feed cut out and I slowly closed my laptop. Brenda had just handed me the keys to her castle. I watched the screen go dark and closed my laptop just as Jamal walked back into the hospital room. He looked visibly lighter, as if a massive physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He sat back down next to Clara, gently taking her hand. I did not tell him about the financial trap I was currently building around his mother. He had just made the hardest decision of his life to protect his new family, and he deserved a moment of absolute peace. The corporate slaughter that was about to take place was my burden to carry, not his. Meanwhile, across the city, Brenda was moving with the reckless speed of a cornered animal. Through Dominic's continuous surveillance of their communication networks, I listened as she aggressively dialed her senior wealth broker. She did not ask for financial advice, she demanded immediate obedience. She ordered him to finalize the paperwork for a $10 million bridge loan from Apex Holdings before the end of the business day. The broker sounded utterly terrified on the recorded call. He practically begged her to reconsider. He explained that using the ancestral family estate as collateral for a high-interest corporate bridge loan was incredibly dangerous. If the commercial real estate market dipped, or if they missed a single payment deadline, Apex Holdings would have the legal right to foreclose on their multi-million-dollar home within 48 hours. Brenda laughed at him. She called him a coward with no vision. "I do not pay you to give me financial lectures," Brenda snapped over the phone. "I pay you to execute my orders. My family has been doing business in Colorado for 4 generations. Apex Holdings knows exactly who we are. They are not going to foreclose on a historic estate over a temporary cash flow issue. Just push the application through. I played golf with the regional director of Apex last month. He will approve it instantly without looking twice at the collateral." What Brenda did not understand was that regional directors at Apex Holdings do not approve high-risk corporate loans. They only facilitate the initial introductions. Every single application involving collateral over $5 million gets routed directly to the Senior Risk Assessment Division in Denver. My division. My desk. Apex Holdings was not a friendly community bank. It was a ruthless corporate equity firm known on Wall Street for swallowing distressed assets. We specialized in offering fast, massive liquidity to failing companies who had exhausted all other traditional banking options. But our money came with brutal, uncompromising strings attached. Brenda was too arrogant to read the fine print. She assumed her elite last name was a magical shield that protected her from the consequences of bad debt. 2 hours later, my secure work phone buzzed with an automated alert. A new priority file had just been uploaded to the Apex Holdings internal server. I opened the application. There it was. A $10 million request submitted by Brenda's real estate firm, fully backed by the deed to their sprawling mansion. The absolute arrogance radiating from the digital document was staggering. She was literally signing her entire life away, just to fund a vindictive legal war against my pregnant sister. Dominic tapped back into her office audio feed later that afternoon. The panic that had consumed Brenda and Tanya earlier had completely vanished, replaced by an intoxicating delusional sense of victory. I could hear the distinct sound of a champagne cork popping, followed by crystal glasses clinking together. "I told you there was absolutely nothing to worry about," Brenda gloated to Tanya, her voice slurring slightly with expensive champagne. "The broker just called. Apex Holdings accepted the application without a single question. We will have the $10 million wired into our corporate operating account by tomorrow morning. It pays to have the right connections in this city." Tanya sighed, a sound of profound relief. "I was actually nervous for a minute, Mother." Higgins said that lawyer Montgomery was preparing a massive financial discovery motion. If he had seen the empty bank accounts, we would have been ruined. Now we can pay the legal retainers, pay the bank, and completely crush Jamal and that pathetic girl in court. I cannot wait to see the look on Naomi's face when Higgins serves them with the new custody lawsuit, Tanya added, laughing cruelly. She acted so tough in the hospital, pretending they actually had a choice. "Once we freeze whatever pathetic assets they have, they will break." "Exactly," Brenda said, her tone dripping with venom. "We are going to bury them in so much litigation they will not be able to breathe. By the time I am finished, that little garbage man's daughter will be begging me to take the child just so she can afford to eat. Nobody challenges our family and survives. We are completely untouchable." I sat in the quiet hospital corridor, listening to them celebrate their own impending doom. They genuinely believed their old money status and country club connections had saved them. They had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate machine they just borrowed from was currently being piloted by the sister of the woman they had left to freeze in the snow. I left the hospital the next morning and drove straight into downtown Denver. The transition from the quiet, sterile medical ward to the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Apex Holdings always required a massive mental shift. But today I did not just feel like a corporate auditor. I felt like an executioner. I rode the private executive elevator up to the 50th floor, stepping out into a sprawling suite of polished marble and panoramic windows. This was my domain. As the Senior Director of Risk Assessment, I controlled the final flow of billions of dollars in corporate equity. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the main boardroom. The long mahogany table was already surrounded by 12 of my top financial analysts and a few regional directors. The room fell silent the moment I took my seat at the head of the table. We went through the morning docket, quickly dismissing several weak acquisition proposals and greenlighting a few solid corporate restructurings. Then the regional director of the Western Division, a man named Mitchell, cleared his throat and slid a thick red tabbed folder across the polished wood toward me. "I have a priority file that needs immediate senior approval," Naomi Mitchell said, leaning back in his leather chair with a confident smile. "It is a $10 million bridge loan request from a local commercial real estate firm. The regional office has already vetted them. They are a prominent old money family here in Colorado. I actually play golf with the board members. We want to expedite the wire transfer by this afternoon to help them cover a sudden operational deficit." I kept my face completely blank as I reached out and pulled the heavy folder closer to me. I knew exactly whose name was printed on the front cover. $10 million is a massive short-term liquidity request. "Mitchell," I said smoothly, opening the cover, "what are they offering to back a loan of this magnitude? Their commercial properties are already heavily mortgaged." Mitchell nodded, eager to prove his VIP clients were a safe bet. "That is the best part. They are not using their commercial properties as collateral. The primary guarantor is the matriarch of the family, Brenda. She is putting up her private, unencumbered ancestral estate. The mansion and the surrounding acreage are appraised at $12.5 million. It is completely paid off. It is an incredibly secure asset for us to hold." I looked down at the crisp, legally binding documents inside the folder. There it was. Brenda had personally signed the collateral agreement offering up the massive estate where she had spent her entire life looking down on people like my sister. The sheer blinding arrogance of her decision was almost hard to process. She was so entirely confident in her elite status that she was willing to gamble the roof over her head just to fund a spiteful legal war. She honestly believed that Apex Holdings was just a bank that would gladly take her interest payments and look the other way. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I traced my finger over Brenda's signature. Mitchell noticed my expression and looked slightly confused. "Is there a problem with the file, Naomi?" I looked up, meeting the eyes of the men and women around the table. "Mitchell," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet boardroom, "you rely far too heavily on country club gossip and perceived wealth. Did your regional underwriters actually look at their Series B bond issuances from the last 6 months?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "We reviewed their reported occupancy rates. They claim their buildings are 95% full. They are lying," I stated flatly, dropping the file onto the table with a loud smack. "Their actual occupancy rate is hovering around 40%. They are currently committing federal bond fraud to cover their massive operating losses. They have a $5 million balloon payment due to a primary lender in less than a week, and their corporate accounts are completely drained because they just liquidated their emergency reserves to pay a team of expensive family lawyers." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the boardroom. The analysts quickly began typing on their laptops, desperately trying to verify the financial bombshell I had just dropped. Mitchell turned pale, realizing he had almost authorized a massive loan to a fraudulent sinking company. "If they are insolvent and committing fraud," Mitchell stammered, "we need to deny the application immediately and flag them in the federal banking system." "No," I said quietly, leaning forward and resting my hands on the mahogany table. "If we deny the loan, they will just scramble to find a predatory private lender. We are not going to deny it." Mitchell stared at me in shock. "You want to approve a $10 million wire transfer to a company you just proved is bankrupt?" "I am taking personal control of this file," I replied, picking up the folder and standing up from my chair. "I want the legal department to draft the approval contracts immediately, but I am going to personally restructure the terms. They want our money, Mitchell, and I am going to give it to them." I instructed the room to clear out, asking only my lead corporate attorney, a sharp man named David, to remain behind. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the expansive boardroom. I handed David the red folder containing Brenda's loan application. I told him we were going to approve the $10 million bridge loan, but we were going to restructure the collateral agreement with a very specific lethal addition. I wanted him to embed an immediate recall clause deep within the fine print. In the world of corporate finance, an immediate recall clause is the ultimate poison pill. It stipulates that if the borrower is found to have misrepresented any financial data on their application, or if they are actively under investigation for any federal financial crimes, Apex Holdings has the absolute right to demand full repayment of the loan within 24 hours. If the borrower cannot produce the cash, we instantly seize the collateral. No court battles, no grace periods, total immediate foreclosure. David read through the file, his eyes widening as he saw the falsified occupancy rates I had provided from Dominic's hack. He looked up at me, a sharp smile forming on his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. I was not just giving a failing company a loan, I was handing them the rope to hang themselves. David assured me he would bury the clause so deep in the dense legal jargon of page 47 that Brenda's standard real estate lawyers would never catch it unless they combed through it for days. But Brenda did not have days. She had a massive bank payment due, and her legal team was currently suffocating under the weight of Richard Montgomery's aggressive family court filings. I walked back to my corner office and sat at my desk watching the Denver skyline through the windows. 2 hours later, David sent me the finalized digital contract. It was a masterpiece of predatory corporate law. I authorized the release of the document to Brenda's broker via our secure digital signing portal. Now all I had to do was wait. Dominic tapped into the audio feed of Brenda's office just as the email notification pinged on her computer. I put my earpiece in, listening intently. Tanya was pacing the room complaining loudly about the endless list of demands Richard Montgomery had just served their lawyers. She sounded exhausted. Brenda, however, sounded completely manic. The Apex contract just arrived. Brenda announced, her leather chair squeaking as she leaned forward to click the mouse. $10 million. Finally, some excellent news. Mother, shouldn't we send it to Higgins to review before you sign it? Tanya asked hesitantly. Brenda scoffed loudly. Higgins is currently billing us an absolute fortune to fight that ridiculous charity lawyer your sister-in-law hired. I am not paying him another $5,000 to read a standard loan agreement. It is Apex Holdings, Tanya. They are a massive corporate machine. They use boilerplate templates for all their clients. There is absolutely nothing in here that we cannot handle. Besides, the commercial bank is breathing down our necks. We need this cash wired into our accounts by tomorrow morning. I stared at the digital tracker on my computer screen. It showed the exact page Brenda was currently viewing in real time. She was scrolling through the 70-page document at a ridiculous speed. She spent exactly 3 seconds on page 47. She did not read a single word of the immediate recall clause. She was so blinded by her own arrogance, so convinced of her absolute superiority, that she treated a $10 million corporate equity contract like a simple terms of service agreement. She reached the final signature page. I held my breath, watching the progress bar load on my screen. This loan is going to fix everything, Brenda declared confidently over the audio feed. Once we pay off the bank, we use the rest to crush Jamal and Clara. I am going to make them regret the day they ever crossed me. A loud, sharp ping echoed from my computer speakers. A bright green checkmark appeared on my screen. Brenda had applied her digital signature. The contract was instantly finalized, time-stamped, and legally binding. The $10 million would be transferred, but it did not matter. She had just formally signed away her ancestral home, her primary source of leverage, and her entire future. By legally swearing her application was completely truthful, she had triggered the trap. She put her entire life directly into my hands, and she had absolutely no idea that the jaws had just snapped completely shut around her neck. 3 days later, the trap was fully primed. It was Saturday evening, the night of the highly anticipated 35th anniversary gala for Brenda's real estate firm. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Denver. I sat in the back of a black luxury sedan, parked just across the street, watching the city's most elite power players arrive. Valets rushed to open the doors of imported sports cars and stretched limousines. Women in designer gowns and men in tailored tuxedos floated up the red carpet, completely unaware that they were attending a celebration funded entirely by fraudulent corporate debt. Inside the ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Dominic had hacked into the hotel's security cameras, giving me a perfect view on my tablet. There were towering crystal ice sculptures, imported orchids, cascading from the ceiling, and waiters circulating with silver trays of vintage champagne. Brenda had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the $10 million from Apex Holdings the moment it cleared her account to project an illusion of absolute financial invincibility. She had used a portion of my company's money to pay her commercial bank just enough to delay their audit, and funneled another massive sum directly to her new team of cutthroat lawyers to continue harassing Clara. The remaining cash was being burned right here in this room to maintain her aristocratic facade. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted the system, crushed her rebellious son, and secured her empire for another generation. I watched her on the screen, standing near the center of the room, in a stunning emerald green gown dripping in diamonds. She was holding court with the mayor and several prominent state senators, laughing loudly and accepting their praises. Tanya stood right beside her, wearing a custom silk dress, looking down her nose at the waitstaff and completely reveling in the borrowed power. I checked my watch. It was almost time. I was not wearing my usual corporate gray suit. Tonight I wore a sharply tailored deep crimson blazer and black trousers. I looked like a woman who owned the room because technically, as of 5 o'clock this evening, I did. I tapped my earpiece to connect with Dominic. I asked him if the legal notices were ready to be deployed. He laughed softly in my ear, confirming that every single financial institution, news outlet, and board member in the city would receive the foreclosure documents the moment I gave the signal. I told him to stand by. I stepped out of the sedan and handed my keys to the valet. I walked past the security checkpoint with absolute ease. I did not need an invitation. I was the senior director of the firm that held the deed to the entire building's event space. I slipped into the back of the ballroom just as the heavy velvet curtains closed and the orchestral music faded. A spotlight hit the main stage. Brenda walked up to the crystal podium, the crowd erupting into polite, enthusiastic applause. She raised her hands, soaking in the admiration with a sickeningly smug smile. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and politicians. She began her speech by boasting about her family's historic roots in Colorado, detailing how they had built a real estate empire from the ground up through sheer brilliance and superior breeding. She spoke about the heavy burden of leadership and the absolute necessity of maintaining a pristine public image. Then her tone shifted. The fake humility vanished, replaced by a cold, pointed arrogance. She looked directly at the camera broadcasting the event, knowing Jamal and Clara might be watching. She stated that securing a legacy sometimes requires painful sacrifices. She said that a true empire must constantly be pruned to survive. She proudly announced that over the past week she had made the difficult decision to trim the fat from her own family tree. She claimed she had severed ties with ungrateful, weak individuals who threatened to dilute their powerful bloodline. She spoke about cutting off those who lacked the mental fortitude to exist in their elite world, essentially bragging to a room full of millionaires about disowning her own son and abandoning her pregnant daughter-in-law. The crowd, completely ignorant of the horrific context behind her words, raised their glasses and cheered. They applauded her ruthlessness, mistaking her cruelty for strong corporate leadership. Brenda smiled brightly, raising her own crystal flute of champagne to toast her supposed victory. She thought she was the apex predator in the room. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the real apex predator was currently standing in the shadows at the back of the ballroom, waiting for the applause to die down, so the slaughter could begin. The polite applause for Brenda finally began to fade, replaced by the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy patrons whispering their praises. Brenda smiled radiantly, basking in the total adoration of the room. She turned gracefully, the diamonds on her neck catching the harsh glare of the stage lights, and handed the silver microphone to Tanya. Tanya stepped confidently up to the crystal podium. She smoothed down the front of her expensive custom silk dress and looked out at the sea of investors and politicians. She desperately wanted her own moment in the spotlight. She wanted to prove to everyone in that room that she was just as ruthless and unyielding as her mother. Tanya tapped the microphone, the sharp amplified sound cutting through the remaining chatter in the grand ballroom. She began by thanking the esteemed guests for attending, offering hollow praises for her mother's incredible corporate vision. But she could not resist the urge to twist the knife. Her ego demanded it. She pivoted sharply to her favorite topic, which was her own perceived superiority over anyone she deemed beneath her. Tanya leaned closer to the microphone, a deeply malicious glint in her eyes. She let out a theatrical sigh. As my mother just beautifully stated, protecting a corporate legacy is a full-time job. Tanya purred, her voice echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings. It is a very dangerous world out there, especially for young, naive men with massive trust funds. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. They anticipated a witty joke. We all know someone who threw their entire life and reputation away because they fell under the spell of a desperate gold digger. Tanya continued, her tone dripping with absolute venom. You know exactly the type of woman I mean. Someone from the wrong side of the tracks who looks at a wealthy, prominent family not as a partnership but as a walking ATM. The crowd chuckled louder this time, completely oblivious to the horrific reality behind her words. It is truly tragic watching a man abandon a historic birthright just to play house with a woman who cannot even afford her own basic medical bills, Tanya said, smiling brightly, as if she were delivering a brilliant comedy routine. Some people simply do not belong in our world. They cannot survive the pressure, and frankly, they do not have the pedigree. So we cut them loose. We let them freeze out in the cold where they belong. Tanya was practically glowing with vindictive joy. She thought it was the absolute perfect punchline. She believed Jamal and Clara were miles away, sitting in a sterile hospital room, entirely broken, terrified, and defeated by her mother's expensive legal team. But Tanya did not get to finish her next sentence. At the exact moment the audience's laughter reached its peak, the massive 12-foot-tall oak and brass doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a terrifying, deafening crash. The heavy wood hit the marble walls so violently that the sound echoed like a physical blow over the ballroom's sound system. The laughter in the room died in an instant. Hundreds of heads whipped around, turning toward the back of the venue. I stepped through the doorway. The deep crimson of my tailored blazer stood out like fresh blood against the sea of black tuxedos and pale pastel gowns. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side were two massive corporate security guards. They were dressed in sharp black suits with earpieces, their expressions completely made of stone, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. The sudden violent interruption shattered the carefully curated elegance of the gala. Waiters froze in place, balancing silver trays of champagne. Elite politicians lowered their glasses in confusion. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. I did not pause. I did not wait for an invitation or offer an apology. I began walking directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. My heels clicked rhythmically and sharply against the polished marble floor, sounding like a ticking clock in the dead silent room. The crowd naturally parted for me, stepping aside as if they could physically feel the sheer weight of the power I was carrying. Up on the brightly lit stage, the smug aristocratic satisfaction completely melted off Tanya's face. It was replaced instantly by utter paralyzing shock. Brenda took a step backward, her hand trembling so violently that she dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the hard stage floor, the sharp sound ringing out loudly. They recognized me immediately. I was the broke, insignificant sister of the girl they had left to die in the snow. I was the woman they thought they had crushed into submission. But as I marched toward the stage, flanked by elite security and radiating absolute control, they finally realized something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Brenda's breath hitched, her eyes darting frantically toward the hotel management, expecting someone to intervene and throw me out. But no one moved. The hotel manager standing near the catering tables had already been briefed by my legal team. He knew exactly who owned the building's debt. He simply looked down at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with Brenda. Tanya gripped the edges of the crystal podium, her knuckles turning completely white. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand my immediate removal, but the words refused to come out. The terrifying reality of my presence was destroying her brain's ability to process the moment. I did not break eye contact with Brenda for a single second as I closed the distance. I was walking into their palace, and I was about to burn it entirely to the ground. Tanya was the first to break the paralyzing silence. Her initial shock violently morphed into frantic defensive anger. She gripped the crystal podium, leaning heavily into the microphone she still held. "Security!" Tanya shrieked, her voice cracking violently over the massive sound system. "What are you doing? Remove this woman immediately. Throw the trash out of my gala right now." She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. A few of the hotel security guards stationed near the catering tables instinctively stepped forward, but the general manager immediately held out his arm, physically stopping them. He shook his head sharply. He had received the legal briefings from my corporate attorneys an hour before the event began. He knew that touching me would result in the immediate termination of his career and a massive lawsuit for the Ritz-Carlton. When no one moved to grab me, Tanya began to panic. She looked wildly at the wealthy politicians and investors in the front row, expecting one of them to intervene on her behalf. But the elite crowd was completely mesmerized by the spectacle. They thrive on corporate blood sport. They sensed a massive power shift in the room, and none of them were willing to step into the crossfire to protect a woman they only tolerated for her money. I completely ignored Tanya's hysterical screaming. I did not even glance in her direction. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead as I bypassed the center tables and walked deliberately toward the elevated audiovisual booth on the left side of the ballroom. The sound engineer, a young man in a black polo shirt, stood up abruptly as my two massive security guards stepped up to the booth. He looked terrified, holding his hands up in a universal gesture of surrender. I stepped past him, reaching directly over the massive mixing console. I grabbed the primary audio cable connecting Tanya's stage microphone to the main speakers and pulled it out with a sharp, decisive yank. Tanya was still screaming on the stage, demanding my arrest, but suddenly her voice was entirely cut off. She tapped her microphone frantically, her mouth moving in silent, desperate anger. The visual of her standing there completely muted and powerless in front of hundreds of people was absolute perfection. I picked up the master microphone resting on the engineer's desk. This microphone bypassed the stage controls entirely. I tapped it once. The sharp, heavy thud echoed through the grand ballroom, commanding the immediate attention of every single billionaire, state senator, and real estate mogul in the room. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with crystal clear, unwavering authority. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities. I know you were all enjoying a beautiful speech about corporate legacies and the importance of cutting off dead weight." I stepped out of the tech booth and began walking slowly toward the front of the stage. The crowd parted for me again, their eyes darting between my calm, collected posture and the absolute meltdown happening up on the platform. Brenda was clutching her chest, looking like she was about to faint. Tanya had thrown her useless microphone onto the floor and was backing away. "My name is Naomi." I continued, stopping right at the base of the stage, looking up at the two women who had tried to murder my sister. "And I am not here to crash a party. I am here in my official capacity as the Senior Director of Risk Assessment for Apex Holdings." A loud collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The investors and corporate bankers in the room knew exactly who Apex Holdings was. They knew we were the financial Grim Reaper. When an Apex director walked into a room with security guards, it meant a corporate execution was about to take place. Brenda finally found her voice. She stumbled to the edge of the stage, her aristocratic mask completely shattered. "You cannot be here," she stammered, her voice raw and shaking. "I just signed the loan agreement. You gave me the $10 million. I paid the bank. We have a legally binding contract." I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made the politicians in the front row nervously shift in their seats. "You are absolutely right, Brenda," I said, my voice ringing out clearly for the entire ballroom to hear. "We do have a legally binding contract. A contract that required you to swear under penalty of perjury that your financial statements were completely accurate. A contract that you clearly did not bother to read before signing away your entire life." I stood at the base of the stairs leading up to the stage, my two security guards anchoring the space behind me like stone pillars. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The smell of expensive perfume and vintage champagne now mingled with the undeniable scent of absolute fear radiating from the women above me. Tanya's eyes were wide with a terror she could not hide. She looked at her mother for guidance, but Brenda was hyperventilating, her carefully styled hair beginning to fall out of place. They had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable objects. They had abandoned my sister to freeze on a mountain because they thought they were untouchable gods. Now, standing under the glaring ballroom lights, they were realizing that they were nothing more than prey. I let the silence hang in the air for just another moment, allowing the absolute terror to sink deep into their bones. Every single person in that room was hanging on my next word. I held the microphone closer to my mouth, preparing to deliver the final financial blow. I held the microphone up my eyes, locked on Brenda's pale, trembling face. For those of you in the audience who are not familiar with corporate equity contracts, I began my voice completely devoid of mercy. Apex Holdings includes a specific contingency in all our short-term bridge loans. It is called an immediate recall clause. It states that if a borrower is found to have falsified financial data on their application, the entire balance of the loan is due immediately. Brenda grabbed the edge of the crystal podium to keep herself from collapsing. Her knuckles were bone white. "I did not falsify anything," she gasped, though her voice barely carried past the first row. "You claimed your commercial properties were operating at 95% capacity," I said, projecting my voice so every single investor could hear her crimes. "But internal rent rolls which my team legally acquired prove your buildings are completely empty. They are hovering at barely 40% occupancy. You lied to Apex Holdings. But much worse than that, Brenda, you lied to the people in this room. You committed federal bond fraud to cover your massive operating losses, using the new money to fund your luxury lifestyle while your empire rotted from the inside out." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The polite elite silence shattered into an uproar of angry shouts. Several prominent investors in the front rows, men who had undoubtedly purchased Brenda's Series B bonds, stood up, their faces red with fury. One wealthy state senator slammed his glass down on the table, pointing an accusing finger at the stage. They realized they had been scammed by a woman pretending to be royalty. Tanya covered her face with her hands, backing away until she hit the velvet curtain. "Mother, tell them it is a lie," she cried out. But Brenda could not speak. She was hyperventilating, staring at me in absolute horror. Because of this massive fraud, the immediate recall clause was triggered at exactly 5 o'clock this evening, I announced, raising a thick stack of legal documents I had taken from my blazer pocket. Apex Holdings formally demanded the immediate repayment of the $10 million we wired you yesterday. "I do not have it," Brenda whispered, tears spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. "I paid the commercial bank. I paid the lawyers. The money is gone." "I know," I replied, smiling coldly, "which brings us to the collateral. Since you could not repay the loan within the contractual deadline, Apex Holdings exercised its legal right to execute a total asset seizure. As of an hour ago, my company formally foreclosed on your ancestral estate. Your mansion now belongs to us." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The absolute destruction of a historic Colorado dynasty was happening live on stage. But we did not stop there. I continued, taking a step closer to the stage. "When you defaulted on our loan, it triggered a cross-collateralization clause with your primary commercial lenders. We bought up that toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. So Brenda, it is not just your house. Apex Holdings just foreclosed on your entire real estate firm. We own your empty commercial buildings. We own the fleet of luxury company cars parked outside with the valet. And because your firm held the master commercial lease on this specific hotel property to host your exclusive events, we just foreclosed on the very ballroom you are standing in." The sheer magnitude of the loss hit Brenda like a physical blow. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the hard stage floor, her expensive emerald gown pooling around her. She was no longer a powerful matriarch dictating terms. She was a broken, bankrupt fraud, sitting in the ruins of her own arrogance. "You have absolutely nothing left," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, cutting tone that silenced the murmuring crowd. "Your credit is destroyed. Your company is liquidated. Your bank accounts are frozen. You spent your entire life treating people like garbage because you thought your money made you superior. You tried to murder my sister and steal her child because you thought you could buy your way out of the consequences. But you forgot one crucial rule of corporate survival, Brenda. There is always a bigger shark." Tanya fell to her knees next to her mother, sobbing hysterically. The custom silk dress she bragged about was now just a symbol of the massive debt she could never repay. The elite crowd did not offer them an ounce of sympathy. They were too busy pulling out their cell phones, frantically calling their wealth managers to dump any stock tied to Brenda's family name. The untouchable empire was dead. The ballroom instantly descended into absolute uncontrollable chaos. The polite murmurs of the elite crowd morphed into frantic shouts and panicked directives. Men in tailored tuxedos began sprinting toward the exit doors, completely abandoning the formal gala decorum. They were desperately pressing cell phones to their ears, barking orders at their wealth managers to liquidate every single asset tied to Brenda's real estate portfolio before the markets opened on Monday morning. I watched a prominent state senator, a man who had just been toasting to Brenda's superior bloodline, literally shove past a waiter to escape the toxic fallout of her collapsing empire. The illusion of high society loyalty vanished in seconds. In the corporate world, there are no friends when the money disappears. On the stage, Brenda's shock finally boiled over into pure, unhinged hysteria. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive emerald gown catching under her heel and tearing audibly. She did not care. She lunged toward the edge of the stage, her face twisted into a terrifying mask of absolute hatred. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You set me up!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking wildly. "You planned this. You are a disgusting, manipulative criminal. I'm going to sue you for everything you are worth. I will drag you through the federal courts until you are begging for mercy. You cannot take my home." My two security guards immediately stepped forward, placing themselves firmly between me and the stage. I did not even flinch. I just looked up at her and offered a slow, deliberate nod. "I did plan this, Brenda," I replied, my voice perfectly steady over the microphone, slicing through her hysterical screaming. "I planned it the exact second you decided to leave my pregnant sister on a freezing mountain highway. And you cannot sue me. You signed the contracts willingly. You committed the fraud. You dug this grave with your own sheer arrogance, and I simply pushed you inside." Hearing the reality of the situation spoken so bluntly finally broke through Tanya's panic. She had been sobbing on the floor, but the realization that her luxurious life was officially over hit her like a freight train. She had no trust fund. She had no mansion. She did not even own the designer dress she was currently wearing, because the credit card used to buy it was now tied to a bankrupt, seized corporate account. Tanya slowly stood up. She did not look at me. She turned entirely toward her mother. The deep, ingrained loyalty that Brenda constantly bragged about evaporated the moment the bank accounts hit zero. "This is your fault," Tanya shouted, her voice trembling with absolute fury. Brenda stopped screaming at me and turned to her daughter, looking genuinely shocked. "Tanya, what exactly are you doing? We have to stand together." "Stand together!" Tanya shrieked, stepping aggressively toward her mother. "Stand together in what? A cardboard box. You lost everything. You told me the bond fraud was completely foolproof. You told me the bank would never find out about the empty buildings. You forced me to lie to the investors." "Shut your mouth!" Brenda hissed frantically, looking around at the remaining politicians and bankers who were now actively recording the public meltdown on their phones. Tanya stopped talking right now, but Tanya was completely unhinged. She turned toward the remaining crowd, desperate to save her own skin, willing to throw her mother directly under the legal bus. "It was all her idea," Tanya screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing directly at Brenda's chest. "I did not want to falsify the occupancy rates. She made me do it. She told me if I did not sign the forged documents, she would cut me out of the family will. She was stealing the investors' money to pay for her own personal debts. I am a victim of her manipulation." Brenda gasped aloud, clutching her chest as if physically stabbed. The golden child, the daughter she had groomed to inherit her ruthless empire, was now aggressively selling her out to stay out of federal prison. "You ungrateful brat!" Brenda roared, lunging forward and actually grabbing Tanya by the shoulders of her silk dress. "I gave you everything. I bought you your entire life." "You ruined my life!" Tanya screamed back violently, shoving her mother away. Brenda stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the polished wood. She crashed hard into the crystal podium, sending it toppling to the floor, shattering into pieces exactly like her pristine legacy. I stood completely motionless, silently watching the two women tear each other to shreds. They were no longer terrifying aristocrats. They were just two desperate criminals turning on each other the exact moment their ship finally slipped beneath the freezing water. I stood completely unfazed, a silent observer in the center of the storm I had created. The stage of the grand ballroom had transformed into a grotesque gladiator arena. Brenda and Tanya, two women who had spent their entire lives obsessing over etiquette, posture, and public perception, were now physically tearing each other apart in front of the city elite. Tanya violently shoved her mother backward, her perfectly manicured nails catching the delicate fabric of Brenda's custom emerald gown, ripping it further along the seam. Brenda retaliated by slapping Tanya across the face, a sharp, echoing crack that momentarily stunned the younger woman before she lunged forward again. They screamed vicious insults, airing decades of toxic family secrets, completely oblivious to the hundreds of smartphone cameras recording every single pathetic second. The wealthy investors and politicians who had not already fled the venue were gathered near the exits, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Brenda had spent a fortune renting this ballroom and inviting the most powerful people in Colorado to witness the absolute peak of her corporate dominance. Instead, she had paid for an audience to broadcast her complete and utter destruction. I watched as Tanya backed away from her mother, pointing frantically at the crowd, begging anyone to listen to her. She screamed that she was willing to turn state evidence that she had emails proving Brenda masterminded the entire bond fraud scheme. Brenda shrieked in response, accusing Tanya of skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars from their corporate charity fund to pay for her extravagant vacations. They were literally doing the federal prosecution's job for them, entering verbal confessions into the public record out of sheer, desperate spite. I let them fight for a few more minutes. I wanted them to completely exhaust themselves. I wanted them to feel the absolute rock bottom of their humiliation. When Brenda finally dropped to her knees again, gasping for air and clutching her ruined dress, and Tanya stood over her, hyperventilating and mascara streaming down her face, I decided it was time to end the spectacle. I signaled the two massive security guards flanking me. They stepped forward in perfect synchronization, their heavy boots thudding against the stage floor, creating a physical barrier between the two hysterical women. I raised the master microphone to my lips. I tapped it once, a sharp, deafening pop of audio feedback that instantly silenced the remaining murmurs in the grand ballroom. Brenda and Tanya both snapped their heads toward me, their chests heaving, their eyes wide with the hollow, terrified look of cornered prey. "You thought you were untouchable," I said, my voice cold and echoing through the massive speakers. "You thought you could take a pregnant woman, strip her of her dignity, leave her to freeze to death in the middle of nowhere, and just write a check to make the problem disappear. You believed that your bank accounts gave you the divine right to play God with my family." Brenda stared up at me from the floor, her breathing ragged. "You took my home," she choked out, her voice barely a raspy whisper. "You took my company. You took every single dime I have. Are you satisfied now? What else could you possibly want from me?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. I looked down at her ruined aristocratic facade, feeling absolutely no pity for the monster crouching at my feet. "You misunderstood the entire purpose of my visit tonight," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "Foreclosing on your company and taking your mansion was just standard corporate procedure. That was just business, but what you did to my sister on that mountain was personal." I leaned forward, looking directly into Brenda's terrified eyes. "I did not just come for your money, Brenda," I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. "I came for your freedom." The air in the ballroom seemed to completely evaporate. Tanya let out a small, terrified whimper, backing away until her shoulders hit the velvet curtain behind the stage. Brenda shook her head wildly, refusing to process the reality of my statement. "You see," I continued, standing perfectly straight, "Apex Holdings is heavily regulated. When a client applies for a massive corporate loan using falsified occupancy rates and fraudulent tax returns, my department is legally obligated to report that fraud. The moment you signed that digital contract and swore your financials were accurate, my servers did not just execute a wire transfer. They automatically forwarded your entire unredacted financial history, including the hidden rent rolls my brother extracted from your servers, directly to the federal authorities. Brenda let out a guttural, horrifying scream. It was not a scream of anger, it was the absolute raw sound of a life ending. She finally understood the trap. I had not just bankrupted her. I had hand-wrapped a federal indictment and delivered it to the government on a silver platter. Right on cue, the heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby burst open, and the sharp, undeniable sound of police sirens began to echo from the street outside. The final phase of their destruction had arrived. The wailing of police sirens grew deafening, echoing through the glass windows. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the grand ballroom, casting a surreal, chaotic glow over the ruined gala. The massive oak doors swung violently inward once again. This time it was not corporate security that walked through. It was my Uncle Harrison. He is the captain of the Colorado State Patrol, and tonight he was fully in his element. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing dark windbreakers with yellow letters across their backs. The room, already stunned by my financial execution, fell so dead silent that the only sound was the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots marching across the polished marble floor. Uncle Harrison is a towering man with broad shoulders and a face carved from granite. He spent his entire life upholding the law, and he had a special kind of disdain for wealthy criminals who believed their bank accounts placed them above it. He did not look at the elite politicians cowering near the exits. He did not care about the shattered crystal or the expensive floral arrangements. His eyes were locked dead onto the stage, entirely focused on the 2 women who had tried to murder his pregnant niece. He marched straight down the center aisle, the federal agents fanning out behind him to secure the perimeter. Several wealthy investors tried to scurry out of the way, practically tripping over their own tailored tuxedos to avoid making eye contact with federal law enforcement. Up on the stage, Brenda's utter shock morphed into a frantic, delusional attempt at self-preservation. She scrambled to her feet, desperately trying to smooth down her torn emerald gown and regain some semblance of her aristocratic posture. She stepped toward the edge of the stage, forcing a trembling, entirely fake smile onto her face. She honestly believed she could still talk her way out of this using her country club charm. "Captain, there has been a terrible misunderstanding," Brenda gasped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am Brenda, the owner of this firm. We were just having a minor corporate dispute with this disgruntled woman. You do not need to be here. I know the police commissioner personally. I will call him right now and clear this entire mess up." Uncle Harrison stopped at the base of the stage. He looked up at Brenda, his expression completely devoid of warmth or hesitation. He did not treat her like an elite socialite. He looked at her exactly the way he looked at violent street thugs. "You are not calling anyone." Brenda Harrison barked, his voice booming through the silent ballroom with terrifying authority. "Put your hands where I can see them. Right now, both of you, step away from the podium." Tanya let out a sharp cry of terror and immediately raised her hands, trembling uncontrollably as she backed against the velvet curtain. But Brenda hesitated, her massive ego still refusing to accept reality. "I said, put your hands up," Harrison roared, stepping onto the first stair of the stage. "Do not make me ask you a 3rd time." Brenda finally raised her shaking hands in the air, tears ruining her expensive makeup. Harrison signaled 2 of the federal agents, who quickly marched up the stairs and flanked the 2 women. Harrison stood squarely in front of Brenda, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Brenda, you are under arrest," Harrison announced loudly, making sure his voice carried to the back of the room so every single one of her former friends and investors could hear it. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, which based on the documents my niece just provided the federal government, you absolutely cannot, one will be appointed to you." Tanya began to hyperventilate loudly, her knees buckling as an agent grabbed her arm. "I am innocent," Tanya wailed, completely ignoring her right to remain silent. "I did not do it. It was my mother. She made me do everything. I was just following her orders. Please do not take me to jail." Harrison ignored her pathetic pleas. He grabbed Brenda by the wrist, forcibly pulling her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the completely paralyzed room. It was the beautiful sound of absolute, irreversible justice finally arriving. The fake, arrogant aristocracy was completely dead. It had been brutally replaced by cold steel, massive federal wire fraud charges and the horrifying reality of a very long prison sentence. Tanya continued to sob hysterically against the velvet curtain, begging the federal agents for a plea deal before she had even been formally processed. Uncle Harrison turned his sharp gaze toward her. He gestured to the agent holding her arm, who immediately spun Tanya around and secured a second pair of steel handcuffs around her wrists. The sound of the metal locking made Tanya wail even louder, her custom silk dress now completely wrinkled and stained with her own tears. Brenda struggled against the grip of the agents holding her. "You cannot do this," she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and lingering entitlement. "I am a respected business owner. You cannot arrest me for wire fraud just because a predatory lending company fabricated some rent documents. I will have my lawyers tear this apart by tomorrow morning." Uncle Harrison let out a deep, humorless chuckle. He stepped closer to Brenda, his massive frame casting a long shadow over her. "You are not going to need a corporate lawyer," Brenda Harrison said, his voice deadly calm. "You are going to need a criminal defense attorney. And frankly, even the best one in the country could not save you from the evidence we have. The federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges are just the appetizer. They will undoubtedly put you in federal prison for a decade. But that is not why I am personally here tonight." Brenda stopped struggling. A new, deeper wave of fear washed over her face. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Harrison squared his shoulders. "I am the state patrol captain. I do not usually execute corporate fraud warrants. I am here to personally arrest you and your daughter for reckless endangerment, aggravated assault, and attempted murder in the second degree." The ballroom, which had been buzzing with the quiet, panicked whispers of the remaining guests, plunged back into absolute stunned silence. The elite crowd stared at Brenda in pure horror. Financial fraud was one thing in their world, but attempted murder was an entirely different level of depravity. "That is a lie," Brenda screamed, her face turning a sickly shade of pale. "I never tried to kill anyone. We just played a prank. We left the girl on the road to teach her a lesson. We were going to go back for her. You have absolutely no proof of any intent to harm." Harrison reached into the interior pocket of his heavy tactical jacket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was the exact piece of paper Brenda had thrown onto Clara's hospital bed just 3 nights ago. "Do you recognize this?" Harrison asked, holding the plastic bag up so the stage lights illuminated the signature. "It is a check for $10,000 signed by your hand, dated the exact night my niece was abandoned in -12-degree weather. Naomi handed this over to my detectives the moment she left the intensive care unit. This is not just a piece of paper, Brenda. This is documented proof that you knew exactly what you had done and you attempted to bribe the victim to cover up a violent crime." Brenda stared at the check inside the plastic bag, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. She looked at me standing a few feet away. I offered her a slow, cold smile. I told her in the hospital that the check was an admission of guilt. She was just too arrogant to believe me. But we did not stop there. Harrison continued dropping the check back into his pocket and pulling out a folded printed report. He held up the papers for her to see. "When Naomi alerted us to the situation, my team immediately secured a warrant for the onboard computer of your luxury SUV. We extracted the GPS tracking data and the internal door lock logs from that night." Tanya let out a choked gasp, realizing exactly what the data would show. "The logs clearly show you driving up Route 82. Harrison stated, reading from the report. "They show you pulling over on a desolate stretch of highway. The sensors record the rear passenger door opening. 3 seconds later, the central computer shows the driver manually engaged the child safety locks and the primary door locks. You then idled for exactly 14 seconds, watching her stand in the freezing wind before you accelerated aggressively back toward Denver. That is not a prank. That is a premeditated attempt to eliminate a pregnant woman. This concludes the entire charade. Harrison stepped back and nodded to his federal agents. "Take them straight to the holding cells downtown," he commanded. The elite guests watched the absolute downfall. Brenda broke down. The federal agents did not show a single ounce of sympathy for the ruined aristocrats. They flanked Brenda and Tanya, gripping their arms firmly to prevent any sudden movements. Uncle Harrison took the lead, carving a path through the stunned crowd of elites. As they were marched toward the exit, the reality of the situation finally seemed to crush whatever fight Brenda had left in her. She kept her head down, her meticulously styled hair falling across her face, trying to hide from the harsh glares of the people she had spent her life trying to impress. Tanya, on the other hand, was an absolute mess. She tripped over the hem of her ruined custom silk dress, her knees buckling every few steps. She continued to sob loudly, pleading with the agents, promising them money she no longer possessed if they would just take the handcuffs off. As they approached the massive double doors of the grand ballroom, the hotel management scrambled to hold them open. The procession moved out into the opulent Ritz-Carlton lobby. The marble floors, usually reserved for quiet, wealthy patrons, echoed with the heavy boots of law enforcement and the hysterical cries of a disgraced heiress. I followed closely behind them, watching the absolute destruction of their false empire play out in real time. I wanted to see every single second of their downfall. But the true humiliation was waiting for them just outside the hotel's glass doors. Dominic is incredibly thorough. When he hacked their servers and discovered the massive federal bond fraud, he did not just prepare the financial documents for Apex Holdings. He also compiled a detailed anonymous press package. An hour before the gala began, he had emailed that package to every major news outlet, financial reporter, and local television station in Denver. He tipped them off that the matriarch of one of Colorado's oldest real estate families was about to be arrested for massive corporate fraud and attempted murder right in the middle of her own 35th anniversary gala. The moment the automatic glass doors of the hotel lobby slid open, the cold night air rushed in, accompanied by the blinding, chaotic flash of dozens of camera strobes. A massive crowd of reporters, cameramen, and journalists had completely swarmed the red carpet outside the Ritz-Carlton. News vans with their satellite dishes raised were parked illegally along the curb, their bright headlights illuminating the scene. As Brenda and Tanya were shoved out into the freezing night, the press erupted. Microphones were thrust aggressively toward their faces. Reporters shouted rapid-fire questions demanding to know if the allegations of faking occupancy rates were true and asking how a mother could intentionally leave her pregnant daughter-in-law to freeze on a mountain pass. Brenda flinched violently, turning her face away from the blinding camera flashes. She tried to hide her handcuffed wrists beneath the torn fabric of her emerald gown, but it was useless. The heavy steel caught the light perfectly, a glaring symbol of her absolute failure. Tanya shrieked at the cameras, trying to kick at a photographer who got too close, which only caused the federal agents to tighten their grip and march her forward even faster. The perp walk was a brutal, agonizingly slow procession down the red carpet that Brenda had paid for to celebrate her own greatness. Now that same carpet was the stage for her total public humiliation. The footage of them being shoved into the back of heavily armored federal transport vehicles would be broadcast on every morning news show in the state. Their faces contorted in fear and disgrace would be splashed across the front pages of the financial journals they used to read over their expensive brunches. I stood just inside the warm hotel lobby, watching the federal vehicles peel away from the curb, their sirens wailing into the Denver night. The reporters immediately began interviewing the shocked gala guests, who were now flooding out of the building. The empire was officially dead. I turned away from the glass doors, pulled out my phone, and dialed Jamal. He answered immediately, the quiet hum of the hospital room audible in the background. "It is done," I told him, my voice calm and steady. "They are in federal custody. The company is foreclosed. They cannot hurt you or Clara ever again." Jamal let out a long, heavy exhale. "Thank you, Naomi," he said softly. "I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," I replied. "Just take care of my sister and my niece." I hung up the phone and walked out of the hotel through a side exit completely unnoticed by the frantic press. The cold mountain air felt incredibly crisp and clean. The financial execution was complete. Now all that was left was the final, undeniable judgment of the law. 6 months passed since the night the empire shattered. The crisp mountain air of winter had given way to the bright, unapologetic heat of a Denver summer. But inside the imposing architecture of the federal courthouse, the atmosphere remained incredibly cold. I sat in the second row of the gallery wearing a sharp charcoal suit. Next to me sat Clara, looking healthy, radiant, and entirely at peace. Jamal sat on her other side, his hand resting gently over hers. We were there to witness the absolute finality of the trap I had set half a year ago. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and a collective hush fell over the remaining spectators. Brenda and Tanya were led in by 2 federal marshals. The transformation was staggering. 6 months in a federal holding facility awaiting trial had completely stripped them of their aristocratic armor. They were no longer the impeccably styled, diamond-draped socialites who used to terrorize Denver's high society. They wore standard-issue, ill-fitting orange jumpsuits. Brenda's hair, once perfectly coiffed, was now entirely gray and pulled back into a severe, messy knot. She looked incredibly frail, her posture hunched, the arrogant fire completely extinguished from her eyes. Tanya looked even worse. She kept her head down, her face pale and gaunt, completely devoid of the malicious energy that used to define her. They shuffled toward the defense table, their wrists still handcuffed to the heavy chains wrapped around their waists. The massive federal fraud case had been open and shut. When Dominic handed over the unredacted corporate servers, the prosecution did not even need to negotiate. The paper trail of the falsified bond documents, the empty commercial buildings, and the desperate loan from Apex Holdings painted a picture of undeniable guilt. But it was the attempted murder charges that truly broke them. Once the GPS data from their SUV was entered into evidence, proving they intentionally abandoned a pregnant woman in sub-zero temperatures, no high-priced defense attorney could save them. Tanya had tried to turn state evidence against her mother to secure a lighter sentence, but Brenda retaliated by releasing emails proving Tanya had actively embezzled from the company's charity fund. They had completely destroyed each other before the trial even began. The judge, an incredibly stern woman with absolutely no patience for corporate criminals, banged her gavel. She looked down at the 2 women standing before her. She did not mince words. She called their actions a grotesque display of greed and a terrifying example of absolute moral bankruptcy. She explicitly stated that their wealth did not make them superior. It only made their crimes more calculated. For the charges of federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit financial fraud and attempted murder in the second degree, the judge announced, her voice echoing powerfully through the courtroom. "I sentence Brenda to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. I sentence Tanya to 12 years in federal prison with mandatory restitution to the defrauded bond investors." A loud gasp echoed from the few former friends who had bothered to show up. Brenda's knees completely buckled. If the federal marshal had not been holding her arm, she would have collapsed onto the courtroom floor. She began to sob silently, her shoulders shaking with the absolute crushing reality of her new life. Tanya let out a soft, pathetic wail, burying her face in her hands. There was no country club connection to save them. There was no magical bank loan to buy their way out. The system they thought they controlled had just swallowed them whole. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched them with quiet, unwavering satisfaction. The courtroom was adjourned. The marshals turned Brenda and Tanya around to lead them back to the transport vehicles. As they shuffled past the gallery, Brenda slowly lifted her head. Her hollow, defeated eyes met mine for a brief second. She looked like a ghost. I simply held her gaze, offering nothing but the cold, hard reflection of her own consequences. She quickly looked away, shuffling out the door to begin her decade and a half behind bars. I turned to Clara and Jamal. They were both smiling, a profound sense of closure washing over them. The heavy toxic shadow that had haunted Jamal's entire life was finally lifted. We walked out of the courtroom together, stepping into the bright Denver sunlight. The legal battle was officially over. But the true victory was not just about locking away the monsters. It was about the incredible life Jamal and Clara had built from the ashes of that horrible night. And I had one final, perfectly executed surprise waiting for them. After the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the federal courthouse, walking into the bright afternoon sun felt like stepping into an entirely different universe. The legal war was officially won, but the true victory was waiting for me just a few miles away. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I drove over to the modest temporary apartment Jamal and Clara had rented while they rebuilt their lives. When I walked through their front door, the air was immediately filled with a profound, undeniable sense of peace. There were no raised voices, no manipulative threats, and no suffocating expectations. Clara was sitting in a plush rocking chair by the large living room window, bathed in warm, golden sunlight. Resting safely against her chest was my beautiful, perfectly healthy newborn niece. She had a full head of dark curls and was sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the massive storm she had survived before she even took her first breath. Seeing Clara holding her baby, both of them safe, warm and radiant, completely erased the lingering nightmare of that freezing mountain highway. Clara looked up at me and smiled, a deep, genuine expression of pure happiness that Brenda had tried so desperately to destroy. Jamal walked out of the kitchen carrying a tray with fresh coffee and pastries. He looked like a completely reborn man. The heavy, suffocating anxiety of trying to please his toxic mother had vanished from his posture. When he walked away from his family's corrupt real estate empire, Brenda swore he would starve. She screamed that he was a failure who was nothing without her money. She was spectacularly wrong. Over the last 6 months, Jamal had poured his incredible talent and relentless work ethic into launching his own boutique architecture firm. Without the restrictive, arrogant demands of his old money family holding him back, his creative vision absolutely flourished. He had already secured 3 major commercial contracts in downtown Denver, based purely on his own merit and brilliant designs. He was building his success from the ground up, proving once and for all that true talent does not require a toxic inheritance to thrive. I sat down on the comfortable sofa across from them, placing my leather briefcase on the coffee table. I took a sip of coffee and told them I had one final piece of official business to discuss. Jamal chuckled softly, wrapping his arm around Clara's shoulders and asking if I had somehow found another hidden bank account to freeze. I smiled, a genuine warm smile this time, and shook my head. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I placed it gently on the glass table and pushed it slowly toward them. I told Jamal to open it. Jamal leaned forward and picked up the envelope. He pulled out the crisp, legally stamped documents inside. As his eyes scanned the thick parchment, his casual smile faded, replaced by a look of absolute, unadulterated shock. His jaw slowly dropped. Clara shifted the sleeping baby slightly to look over his shoulder, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a property deed. Specifically, the deed to a massive, sprawling $12 million estate. But it was not just any luxury estate. It was the exact same ancestral mansion that Brenda had recklessly used as collateral for her fraudulent Apex Holdings loan. When my company officially foreclosed on the property, it was quietly put up for a private corporate auction. I used a significant portion of my own trust fund to buy it outright. I paid for the entire property in cash. There was no mortgage, no debt, and absolutely no toxic strings attached. And the names printed boldly on the title transfer were Jamal and Clara. I looked at my brother-in-law, who was completely speechless, staring at the paper that officially made him the true master of the very house he was raised in. I told him that Brenda thought she could weaponize that estate to control him. She used the promise of inheriting that home as a chain around his neck. Now, he and Clara owned it free and clear. I told them they were going to raise their beautiful daughter in those massive halls with nothing but love, respect, and warmth. They were going to rewrite the entire legacy of that property, replacing decades of cold arrogance with genuine family joy. Clara had tears streaming down her face. She reached out with her free hand to grasp mine, squeezing it tightly. Jamal looked up from the deed, his eyes shining with unshed tears of profound gratitude. He did not need to say a word. The monsters were locked away in federal prison, the toxic empire was completely dismantled, and our family was finally untouchable. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that toxic people always get exactly what they deserve in the end, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of resilience and justice. Let me know in the comments below how you would have handled a mother-in-law like Brenda. Stay strong, always protect your peace, and never let anyone underestimate your true worth. The story of Naomi Clara Jamal and the catastrophic downfall of Brenda's empire serves as a powerful testament to the destructive nature of arrogance and the profound strength found in quiet resilience. Brenda and Tanya operated under the delusion that their status and perceived wealth gave them the absolute right to control abuse and discard others. They equated cruelty with strength and money with invincibility. However, their loud, performative elitism was ultimately a fragile mask hiding massive insecurities and illegal vulnerabilities. This narrative starkly reminds us that true power does not need to constantly announce itself. People who genuinely possess strength, whether financial, intellectual, or emotional, do not use it to crush the vulnerable. They use it to build and protect those they love. Conversely, Jamal and Naomi represent the ultimate antidote to toxic manipulation, unwavering integrity. Jamal's defining decision to walk away from his massive inheritance to protect his wife proves that cutting ties with toxic family members, no matter the immediate financial cost, is often the first necessary step toward genuine freedom. Meanwhile, Naomi's calculated dismantling of Brenda's empire teaches us that while quiet, humble people may seem like easy targets to a narcissist, their silence often masks a formidable depth of capability. You do not have to sink to a bully's level of loud, chaotic aggression to defeat them. Calculated patience, emotional intelligence, and unshakable boundaries will always expose their rotting foundations. Ultimately, the core lesson is clear. Arrogance is a self-made trap, and the most secure fortress a person can build is one constructed from honesty, hard work, and unconditional loyalty to those who truly matter. Take a moment to evaluate the relationships in your own life today, and have the courage to permanently walk away from any toxic dynamics that cost you your peace.